Hello and welcome to ICA in Conversation that broadcasts on the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month and focuses on current issues and challenges in the context of compliance and counter financial crime. I'm Tim Tyler, and coming up, we're going to consider the pivotal role of the Money Laundering Reporting Officer. Of course, it's known by many names across the world, described as the nominated officer or AML officer or financial crime reporting officer, depending on where you are in the world. To do this, I'm delighted to be joined by Ariane Baldwin-Webb. Ariane has senior level experience in a variety of AML and compliance roles at banks and wider financial services, including the MLRO role itself. We worked together where we were together trainers for the ICA, and at that time, a few years ago now, Ariane developed and designed our practical MLRO certification. So it's wonderful to join you for this conversation, Ariane. Thank you so much for finding the time, the interest to join me.
Hello, I'm really excited actually. Can hardly contain myself, so thank you for
Fantastic.
having me.
Bottle that. You hold on to that. Just a few more words by way of setting the scene. As ever, it would be lovely to hear from you wherever you are in the world as you join us. Sometimes it's really interesting to hear which part of the world you join us from, and you might like to add something in the comments section for the event as it's being broadcast, of course, via LinkedIn. And more than that, it's worth just reminding ourselves of the format for this discussion. The first 20 minutes or thereabouts, Ariane and I are going to explore some of the key issues around the MLRO role. And we look to provide 10 minutes at the end to respond to any particular questions or thoughts or challenges that you may have. So please, can I encourage you to add your thoughts through the comments on the LinkedIn event page, and we'll look to come to those. And it may even be that we come to those if they're relevant to what we're discussing between times. So that, I hope, has set the scene. Ariane, once again, thank you for your time. And of course, we're going to talk about the MLRO role. Some have described it as the beating heart of effective anti-money laundering. How do you feel? Is that a good description?
Yes and no. And I say that because the heart implies that the MLRO gets things moving by asking the right questions and pushing for change and having that oversight and helping key parts of the body or the organization make the right decisions, whether that's reactive, proactive, or like our reflexes, how we respond to things. But I would argue that the MLRO role is more like the brain than the heart. And I would argue the heart should be the first line because they create the risks and therefore they should own the risks and therefore they should be asking the right questions and they should be working in tandem together with the MLRO and the rest of the organization, or going along with the analogy of the cardiovascular system and how the body responds.
We could really push this, couldn't we?
We
We could
could
go
we could
quite
keep
some
going
way.
about that, but yeah.
So, so you see that the MLRO acts as the brain, as the cognitive, the function around this. Can you just unpack that a little? Why do you say that?
From a strategic perspective,
Okay,
so looking at the brain is like you're getting signals from the body that's not working properly, you're having a pain here, and then you respond to that in kind. So um, I would call it more of a brain strategic role than it is a, doing role, which is what the
okay,
heart's doing. It's pumping the blood around the body.
okay. We may well come back to that analogy, but I think there's a danger we push it too far. But so then let's go a little bit deeper though in terms of the role itself. What are the key responsibilities?
So it really depends on the size, nature, and complexity of the organization and what other key responsibilities or prescribed responsibilities you've decided to take on as the MLRO. Or which ones you may have delegated. So, for instance, the nominated officer role can be delegated. That's a particular aspect of the role which reports to the NCA or your FIU any sort of suspicious activity. The FCA does definitively say that as an MLRO, acting as a second line of defense, that there should be no responsibility for first line functions, and that the MLRO is really responsible for reporting and escalation to the board, regulators, and other relevant authorities. But purely from an SMF 17 perspective, the responsibilities are broadly described as having appropriate oversight over systems and controls in relation to financial crime. And these include, so there's a long list, and I'm going to list them very
I could
quick.
go on and on, couldn't we?
I could, but
Can you
there's a
give me the
long list.
headlines?
So oversight over the AML regime is one, making sure that CDD and EDD is appropriately conducted. Risk management practices are established via internal controls. And of course, staff training, a big one, continuous improvement. And from my perspective, that also includes making sure the organization has the right growth mindset. And, from that perspective, the MLRO really feeds into that function.
Okay. So just before you carry on, you mentioned the FCA, just
Yeah.
mindful, of course, it's wonderful to see people joining us from Nigeria, Germany, India, Tajikistan, Mozambique, Armenia, France, Texas, Cairo, Kenya, and so it continues. And Miami, I was over in Miami just a few weeks ago. Nolvia, it's great to have you with us. So for those that are joining from overseas, of course, the FCA is the main regulator for financial services, the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK. And SMF 17 that you mentioned?
Yeah, so that's the specific senior management function for MLROs in the UK.
Got it.
And you may
Okay.
have other prescribed responsibilities as well. But let me just carry
Yeah, no,
on
please go ahead. Go ahead.
with that list of things that we are responsible for as MLROs. It includes also risk assessments, and that should be done in conjunction with the first line, including all of the risk controls and residual risks to make sure they're appropriately documented. And mitigated. So, and policies and procedures, making sure that they're accurate, they're tied into the risk appetite and the risk assessments, and that they're used appropriately within the organization, scrutinized. And of course, testing is a key part of that because you don't know if it's effective. Your systems and controls, you don't know if they're effective if they're not tested. I would also say governance and senior management responsibility feeds into that, and having that management information and reporting. So good KPIs, which stands for good performance indicators, good key risk indicators as well, that help management make those really key and informed decisions.
Okay.
Really important pieces. So maintaining good quality of oversight over the current and emerging risk and strategy and threats to the fin crime space, because there's so many fin crime typologies that are always emerging. So that includes also then horizon scanning and being aware of key regulatory changes. So monitoring is all part of that, right? And also monitoring the internal communication of your firm of policies and procedures. So I'll stop there. I know that was
No, it's
a
good.
quick list.
I think we start to see that there's a great deal that the role is responsible for. But can I just clarify one thing? You mentioned first and second line. What's the relationship between the MLRO and the first line?
It's a really important relationship. So the first line should be doing the doing, i.e. they create the risk, they're the business, they create the risk, therefore they need to own the risk. The MLRO has oversight over that. So it needs to be separate functions in order for that oversight to be conducted independently, which means there needs to be a good relationship, because if the MLRO says this is not quite right, this needs tweaking,
Yeah.
From an assurance perspective, I'm not really happy with that. They need to have a good relationship in order to keep moving things forward from an improvement cycle perspective.
Thank you. That's helpful. But there is one question I think that comes out of this. And that is, well, why would anyone want to take this up? But before I come to it, I think it's worth highlighting, of course, that as well as all those risks, there is an accountability and there's a personal risk. MLROs are personally accountable, and we know on occasions that regulators have fined them, have prevented them from carrying out similar roles in the future. Um, and that's something that isn't confined to the UK, it's across much of the world. So, with all of that work, with all of that accountability, and with all of that personal risk, why would anyone want to do this?
Don't forget the health and work-life balance and the
Ah, there's that as
family
well.
relationships
Yes.
aspect.
Yeah.
That's another whole story, right?
Yes. Yes.
Um, the reason people do it, and I think this comes back down to knowing your why. Why do you do the job that you do? And I always refer to Simon Sinek in that he says you need to know your why, because if it becomes your passion, then it's not really work. So I hope for the majority of people taking on this role, it is passion to disrupt the financial crime chain. Um, but for the majority of people, actually, it's career progression. It's the next step in their career because they have the experience in the AML space, they have the knowledge, and they feel it's the next natural step in terms of that direction. But I hope it is passion in the most part to stop crime, to protect future potential victims. And I always say there's an affiliate of organized crime out there that cause damage, and really for us to be effective as fin crime prevention professionals, we need to create our own affiliate to do that, to stop them.
So you touched on something I think which is really important there, and that is that we can place this in the context of a career, and a career very often wholly or in substantial part in compliance or in counter financial crime or in anti-money laundering. Um, the days have passed, I think, when people were just dropped into MLRO roles without meaningful experience, because I think, well, that displayed a lack of awareness and understanding. And of course, for many countries, there's a requirement for the regulator to approve the individuals that take up the roles.
And that
So,
is the case now. Particularly in the UK, the FCA now specifically says that there needs to be some sort of assessment at the end of any MLRO course. And it can't just be a 2 hour, 3 hour, half a day course to get you up to standard. It needs to be assessed at the end, which of course the course for the ICA does, where there is an assessment, and we do have people who fail the course on a regular basis because it's difficult to pass. So
and I guess it's worth mentioning, though, that setting this once again in the career context, there's a requirement to attend the course, that you're already operating at a senior level, either as an MLRO or deputy MLRO or one step away, and you can demonstrate relevant experience and understanding. So once again, we see this career progression coming back.
absolutely. So some people do it because um, there's a degree of engagement in terms of the personal challenges that they're encountering as an MLRO. It's a bit of a balancing act being on that tightrope, and we'll talk about the skills that's needed for that in a bit. But hopefully, that's again because they're passionate about preventing financial crime and from criminals enjoying their ill-gotten gains. Many think that mentoring is a key aspect of all of this. So they
Mhm.
enjoy it, the training, the facilitation aspect of getting people together, socializing their ideas or solutions, and they get a degree of gratification from doing that.
Yeah,
Others like the networking again and the learning aspect of the role because it is a very difficult role to manage, but you do learn an awful lot doing it. Not just in terms of your soft skills, but in terms of the technical stuff. If you haven't already been, dropped in the deep end in terms of the technical knowledge, and of course the experience of doing it as well. Now that there's so many different typologies coming up, AI is creating another huge challenge for MRLOs on how to navigate that and make their systems more
yeah.
robust and more effective. And the improvement cycle is constantly changing. So there is a degree of gratification, maybe the word satisfaction is better, coming out of that at the end when you
Reward.
see things coming to fruition and it's working.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Fleming Clausen, thank you very much for your observation that, of course, thinking about the key responsibilities, It isn't confined to money laundering. It actually is the wider financial crime environment that we're operating in, which would take in fraud, corruption, of course, terrorist financing to a degree, particularly in smaller businesses, sanctions compliance. And so it continues. So we've already started to touch on this, and you did mention the skills requirement. So we've identified that it's important to have a passion around this. We've also, I think, identified that we need to have an understanding, an insight around the different types of financial crime and the regulatory environment. But what are the other skills that you would highlight that we need to develop, grow as individuals to be effective as MLROs?
So I'd actually say that the top skill, other than the technical aspect, is soft skills. It's hugely important and completely underestimated in this role in terms of the requirement for it, because you can have all the technical skills and knowledge you want. If you don't have a way of communicating that and maintaining relationships within role, then you lose support. And when you lose support, you can't get stuff done in an organization. Which, then it removes that piece that the FCA says you need to be able to act on your own authority, you need to be able to act independently, and you don't have that if you lose support. So you need to be able to communicate and have
Okay.
really good soft skills with stakeholder management, being able to build trust and credibility. Influencing and persuasion skills are really important and really difficult to master for anyone. Having a degree of EQ, so emotional intelligence, empathy, understanding the human risk factors. And I think having a stakeholder map at the beginning of your journey can really help, because you can then sort of map where people stand, whether they're important to your decision making, to getting things done in the organization, how often you need to meet them, that kind of thing can be hugely beneficial when you first join. And that also helps you then socialize those issues, which is a key aspect of actually getting
Yes.
anything done in an organization.
Yeah.
So AML technical knowledge, really important. Experience in the AML space, you need that in order to build credibility and to be trusted. And that means you need to know POCA, you need to know the money laundering offences off by heart. You need to know, in the UK that is, Financial Crime Guide, MLSG, latest thematic reviews, final notices, dear CEO letters, all of those things, and understanding the differences in that regulatory writing between the must, should, and may, where you've been put on notice by your regulator. So really understanding those words and then translating that into your policies and procedures and to the business. Um,
Okay.
Firm and sector knowledge of your specific firm as well, really key. You need to understand the risks, the controls, limitations,
Yeah. So important.
technology limitations,
Yeah.
resource limitations. You can't just go in and say, I need 20 people when there's no money, or when
Yeah.
there's no systems to do it. Even if that's the requirement, you need to be pragmatic about that.
So you
Um,
touched on something there that I feel is really important, and it isn't confined to the MLRO role. I see that very often in other compliance related activities where there is a sense of, well, we need to educate the business. We need to tell the business what to do, and we need to make sure that they do it. Well, there's truth there, of course, but I think it maybe is the wrong starting point. Maybe a better and a stronger starting point is we need to thoroughly understand the business. We need to understand the culture, the governance, the supply chain, the operating model, and then we can think about, well, what does our role and does our role interact with the business? How does compliance interact? And we can have conversations that start with the business need and not starting with the compliance requirement. And that makes us so much more effective, I think. But I think that's just repeating what you've just said,
well,
Ariane.
there's a few more actually. I just wanted to mention in terms of
Of course,
skills that I
please.
think
Yeah.
you do need good organization, being methodology. I can never say that properly. Methodological, having
I
good
know what you mean. I know what you mean.
well,
Yeah.
not fully English, so there you go. Good record keeping skills. So you must be diligent in keeping records. That means information that you have that in that particular point in time, you must record that and give a rationale for your decision to act or not to act. And keeping a track is a really good way of doing that. It's all about demonstrating reasonable steps. And you should have a curious mindset, asking questions, trying to get to the root cause,
Yeah.
and of course, staying calm under pressure. And not, it's not necessarily about having a poker face because I'm really bad at that. And you could Botox your face if you wanted to, but I'm not advocating that. Um, but it's a very legacy thing to talk about to have a good poker face. But you shouldn't be panicking when issues occur and jumping up and down or pointing fingers because that's one sure way to lose trust in your stakeholders and your team. And I think I mentioned this earlier, you need to be pragmatic and have that business mindset. It's needed to because, again, it's a balancing of risks and controls that are available in that organization. So um, I talk about the word proportionality, and that's really key. So you can't start a business being risk mature. It's not possible. So a lot of new firms are going to be risk immature, and it's about having the right controls to balance the risks that that presents. So it is about being pragmatic. You can't start a business and assume everything's going to be great. It's never the case.
We're
Um,
not here to promote the MLRO course. That's not why we're here. We're hoping just to, I hope, raise a little bit of awareness around this. But I can't help but notice that much of what you've just been touching on is unpacked in some detail within that course. But
yeah.
let's move on. Um, and I know we could continue in terms of the skills requirement matched to responsibilities, but we've got just about 10 minutes left, and there's some really interesting questions that have been shared by colleagues around the world. So first of all, thank you very much for those questions. Two of them relate to the MLRO role in relationship with the board. Now, I know, Ariane, you and I have talked about this in the past, and the potential for a conflict of interest where the MLRO is themselves a financial stakeholder within the business or in some other way lacks independence and objectivity within the business. So, firstly, can I just ask for a view around that, and then I'd like to also just move on to think about how can the board, how can the MLRO work constructively with the board over time. But first of all, the importance of objectivity.
So it is a tight balancing act. So almost like a balancing on a tightrope, I'd argue. Um, it is really truly about understanding those risks and controls of the firm specific to that business and being able to translate that effectively to the regulator via those soft skills we talked about,
Yes,
demonstrating that you are a safe pair of hands, um, and knowing what your risk thresholds are, what your risk appetite is, how this informs your risk-based approach, and how that then informs the allocation of resources, and how this is evidenced in your KRIs. So it's a in terms of objectivity, be very specific as to what the regulator is asking you, and be as transparent as you can be, and be very specific. It's all about demonstrating those reasonable steps as to your decision making. Um, and having a good relationship with the board and the NEDs, of course, will help. But again, it will depend on the size and complexity of the
yes, of
organization because you
course.
won't always have direct access even. It might be via your chief compliance officer that you have access to, and you may only be invited to the board on an occasional basis to present. So you may not have that access that other smaller organizations have. Um, but having open lines of communication can really help. And in order to sort
Yes,
of coming to your second question about developing an ongoing good relationship with the board, it is about knowing who your NEDs are. Not necessarily, obviously, having regular one-to-ones, that's going to be really difficult, but you want to have an open line of communication with them so that you can, maybe once or twice a year check in. That might be nice in order to just say, yeah, well, how's it going? How are you feeling? Um, there is a degree of and I've said this to you before, I always wonder how much independence NEDs really have because in private companies in particular, they're paid by the company and they're selected by the company to be on that board. So there is there's always a little bit in my mind. I always wonder how independent are they really, but they're there to check up on you. That's their
yeah.
responsibility as a director.
And of course, they're operationally independent, aren't they? So they
Yeah.
have what is a vital role in that context. So uh, J Ishmael, and I'm not sure what the J stands for, but thank you for your question, where you're actually going a little bit further, and you're asking about the role of the MLRO in terms of enabling the board to make clear decisions that are board ready. So um, we don't present to the board the minutiae, the complexity of the change in money laundering regulations, for instance, or other regulations that govern our activity. The board aren't interested, and they don't need to know that level of detail. But how do you get the right balance in terms of sharing sufficient information to inform the right decisions whilst not becoming an encumbrance to the board?
hmm So the board is very time poor and they're visual people. I find that sometimes the board doesn't even read the materials in advance, which
Really? So
I don't know. I mean,
it's good.
that's very
Yeah.
that's a generalization. I shouldn't say that.
No, no, I'm
Um,
with you there. I can
so
see that. Yeah.
so it's important about they're visual people as well. So if you have an ask, a budget ask, be really clear about what that budget ask is and why you need it and what happens if you don't get it. So it's about being really, really simple, making it really difficult for them to say no. That's what I say to the students in the course when they are preparing for their assignments. Make it difficult for someone to say no by being really clear and really concise about what you're asking. And often
Yes.
a visual helps, a table will help with some metrics because, as I said, they don't have the time to spend 40 minutes analyzing a long piece of text with lots of paragraphs in it.
Yeah, but of course, good practice also allows for when you're asking for a decision, you provide options, of course,
Absolutely.
rather than trying to drive them towards a single outcome.
And one key aspect I forgot to mention that we drive throughout the course actually is socialization. So there should be at no point should there be surprises at a decision-making meeting. It should all have been socialized in advance. People should already be on board and understand the background. And that's the key to getting stakeholder buy-in in an organization, I'd say.
Okay, thank you. So I'm looking at, we've got just a few more minutes. I'm looking at some of the other questions that have been asked. Shirley, thank you for your observation that I think we've already picked up on, and that is, of course, that the role of the MLRO isn't confined to money laundering. That there's a statutory role there, and also in relation to terrorist financing and proliferation financing. But inevitably, it rolls into wider financial crime, which we've touched upon. Um, and going on from that, Inga, thank you for your question, where you're saying, how can you find more information on MLRO regulations covering cases with NGOs funds sponsored by the World Bank? I'm thinking, gosh, quite hard about this. So, sponsored by the World Bank and their relations with public political figures. So, can I pick up on that? And I'll throw it open to yourself in a moment, Ariane. Um, Inga, I suspect that there's something behind that question. And on the face of it, it raises all sorts of questions around potential corruption, transparency, beneficial ownership, and the relationship with NGOs, particularly when they're sponsored by organizations like the World Bank and the reputation of those organizations. It would be very difficult, I think, to try and answer that coherently in the space of this
Right.
conversation. But Inga, if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or I'm sure to Ariane, I'll do what I can to share some insight around this after the meeting. But it's a really good question. It sounds like you're facing some interesting challenges.
You might want to also look at the latest financial crime guide on politically exposed persons. So that probably will help.
Okay, Ariane, thank you. So we are moving towards the close. There's one last question I'd like to ask you. We've talked about the career progression, an opportunity for individuals to build towards the MLRO role. Um, what advice would you give to someone who's maybe early in their career, but who aspires to this?
Mm. I'd say don't jump into a MLRO role just because of the title. Research the firm, do your due diligence, assess if it's for you, and only you know yourself best. Um, Ask yourself if you're comfortable being uncomfortable all the time, because that's basically what it is. You're going to be learning. And don't be afraid of a challenge. You often learn the best actually being thrown in the deep end, but prepare, do qualifications like our MLRO course. And I'll throw that in there deliberately, looking at Tim.
And
Um,
there are other courses. Well, actually, I say that I'm not sure there are other courses,
and
but not we isn't just the ICA in this space. We're not here to just nakedly promote the ICA. The important thing is that people get skilled and trained and develop those muscles and the abilities in this space. But sorry, Ariane, back to you.
That's all right. Do your own SWOT analysis. So on your skills, know what your weaknesses are so that you can develop on them. Create a good network of like-minded professionals via forums, MLRO roundtables, conferences. Those late afternoon calls for some advice will come invaluable to you in the future. So absolutely, don't become a hermit when you become an MLRO, no matter how stressful it gets. Make sure you create your network. And it's okay if you don't know something. You don't need to know everything. As long as you know where to find it, you keep your ego in check. And as always, research and do your due diligence, you'll be fine. It's all about taking reasonable steps. No one's asking MLROs to be superheroes. It's impossible because we're also just human. Um, and yeah, I mean, there's lots of great advice out there um, from other people. So rely on your network if you can.
Okay. Ariane, thank you. I think that's a good place to draw this to a close. Thank you once again for taking the time to join us for this conversation. And wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining us, for your comments and for your thoughts. And for those that are watching the recordings of this on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, or on the ICA Learning Hub, where, of course, there are so many resources that help us to maintain our CPD. Wherever you are and whenever you are, thank you for tuning in and do take care.
Thanks for
Bye bye.
having me. Bye.